Sometimes the people who call others trash are only trying to hide the mess inside themselves. I should have thrown the invitation away the second I saw Stephen Whitmore's name written across the envelope in that elegant silver lettering. But instead, I stood there in my kitchen holding it with both hands while snow drifted softly outside my window, and Bing Crosby played through the old radio Thomas insisted on keeping beside the coffee maker. Christmas dinner at my mother's house. I read quietly, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. Stephen and I had been divorced for 6 years. 6 long years of rebuilding my confidence after discovering that the man I spent nearly half my life supporting had somehow convinced me I was never enough. Not pretty enough. Not exciting enough. Not successful enough. And yet there he was, inviting me back into the lion's den like no time had passed at all. "You don't have to go," Thomas said gently from across the kitchen table. He was fixing the loose hinge on one of my cabinet doors, wearing that faded navy work jacket with Reed Facility Services stitched over the chest pocket. His large hands moved carefully, methodically, like a man who respected everything he touched. "I know," I replied. "Then why are you thinking about it?" I looked down at the invitation again. The truth was complicated. Part of me wanted Stephen to see that I was doing fine without him. Maybe even better. Another part of me wanted to stop feeling afraid of people who no longer had any power over me. But mostly, if I was honest, I wanted to prove something to myself. Thomas stood up, wiped his hands with a small towel, and walked over to me. "Helen," he said softly, "the only reason to walk back into a painful room is if you know you're not the same person who walked out of it." That was the thing about Thomas Reed. He never spoke loudly, never tried to impress anyone. But somehow every sentence he said stayed with me longer than it should. I met Thomas 2 years after my divorce. At the time, I was volunteering at the local community center downtown, helping organize literacy classes for adults. Thomas handled building maintenance there 3 days a week. The first thing I noticed about him wasn't his appearance or his job. It was the way he treated people. Whether he was talking to a retired veteran, a nervous single mother, or a teenager cleaning graffiti off the back fence, he spoke to everyone with the exact same level of respect. No performance. No ego. Just kindness. It frightened me at first because after 23 years with Stephen, I had almost forgotten what genuine kindness looked like. "You really think I should go?" I asked. Thomas smiled slightly. "I think nobody should spend Christmas hiding from old ghosts." 3 days later, snow covered most of the neighborhood by early evening as we drove toward Judith Whitmore's house in Thomas's pickup truck. The giant colonial home looked exactly the same as I remembered. Massive reeds hanging from the windows, golden lights wrapped around the trees, luxury SUVs lined along the circular driveway like some kind of country club event. My stomach tightened the second we pulled in. "Still time to fake a flat tire," Thomas joked gently. I laughed nervously. "You'd have to slash your own tire." "For you?" "Maybe." I shook my head, smiling despite myself. But the anxiety returned the second I spotted Stephen through the front window holding a glass of wine and laughing with his sister Claire. He looked older now, colder somehow. The kind of polished aging that expensive suits and bottled confidence could not completely hide. Thomas reached over and squeezed my hand once. "Warm, steady, safe. Ready?" he asked. I took a slow breath and nodded. At that moment, I honestly believed the hardest part of the night would simply be seeing my ex-husband again. I had no idea that before the dinner was over, someone at that table would call the man I loved trash right to his face. The warmth hit us first when Judith opened the front door, carrying the smell of cinnamon candles, roasted turkey, and expensive perfume that somehow always lingered in her house no matter the season. "Helen," she said with a surprised smile that looked practiced instead of sincere. Her eyes moved immediately to Thomas standing beside me. I noticed the tiny pause before she forced another smile. "And you must be Thomas." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas said politely as he offered his hand. Judith shook it lightly, almost carefully, like she was uncertain whether touching him might wrinkle her image of the evening. "Please come in," she replied. The house looked exactly as intimidating as I remembered. Crystal ornaments sparkled across a 14-foot Christmas tree in the foyer. A string quartet version of classic carols played softly through hidden speakers. Every surface looked staged for a magazine photo shoot. And standing near the fireplace with a wine glass in his hand was Stephen. The second he saw me, his eyebrows lifted slightly. Not emotional. Not nostalgic. More like curiosity. Like someone examining an old possession they had forgotten about. Helen, he said smoothly as we approached. You actually came. Merry Christmas to you too, I answered. His eyes shifted toward Thomas. And this is? Before I could answer, Thomas stepped forward naturally. Thomas Reed. It is good to meet you. Stephen shook his hand once, but the smile on his face tightened almost immediately. Reed, he repeated slowly. What do you do, Thomas? I hated that question instantly because I knew Stephen did not ask people what they did to learn about them. He asked so he could measure their worth against his own. I work in facility maintenance, Thomas answered calmly. Stephen nodded once. Maintenance where? Several commercial properties around the county. Claire suddenly appeared beside Stephen holding a martini glass and wearing one of those sharp smiles that always made me feel 16 years old again. Oh my God, she laughed lightly. So he is basically a janitor? The word landed harder than she intended it to sound. I felt the room shift around us. Not loudly, quietly, like invisible lines being drawn. Thomas simply smiled politely. Something like that. Claire gave a soft laugh and took a sip of her drink. Well, every building needs somebody to keep the toilets working. Stephen smirked into his wine glass. Claire. What? She replied innocently. I am complimenting him. I could already feel heat rising into my cheeks. Not because of Thomas. Because I knew exactly what this family was doing. The Whitmores had always treated careers like social rankings. Lawyers mattered. Executives mattered. Investors mattered. Anyone working with their hands became invisible. Or worse, entertainment. Helen used to hate when the dishwasher broke, Stephen added casually. Looks like she solved that problem permanently. A few people nearby laughed softly. My stomach tightened. Thomas did not react. Not even slightly. He simply removed his coat carefully and folded it over his arm. Actually, he said pleasantly, I enjoy fixing things. Claire tilted her head with fake curiosity. That is adorable. I looked at Thomas, waiting for even the smallest sign of irritation, but there was none. Somehow his calmness only made their behavior uglier. Judith stepped in quickly, probably sensing the tension becoming too obvious. Dinner will be ready in 15 minutes, she announced brightly. Everyone head into the living room. As people drifted away, Stephen leaned closer to me while Thomas helped Judith carry a serving tray toward the dining room. You surprised me, Stephen murmured quietly. I did not think you would seriously end up with somebody like him. I stared at him coldly. Somebody like what? His eyes flickered toward Thomas. Come on, Helen. You know what I mean. Before I could answer, Claire suddenly laughed loudly from across the room. Careful, Stephen, she called. You might hurt the janitor's feelings. More laughter followed. Thomas looked up briefly from the tray in his hands. For 1 second our eyes met across the crowded room. He gave me the smallest reassuring smile imaginable. And somehow that hurt even more than if he had looked angry. By the time everyone gathered around the dining table, I already regretted coming. The table itself looked beautiful in the way wealthy families always try to make holidays look beautiful. Crystal glasses reflected the candlelight. Gold-trimmed plates sat perfectly arranged beside folded linen napkins. Tiny white lights ran along the centerpieces between pine branches and red berries. Everything looked warm and festive on the surface. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension building like pressure trapped under ice. Thomas pulled my chair out gently before taking the seat beside me. Across from us, Stephen swirled wine in his glass while Claire scrolled through pictures on her phone, showing off her latest ski trip to Aspen. Judith sat at the head of the table, smiling too brightly, trying desperately to keep the evening polished. Helen, she said suddenly as the first plates were served, I heard you left your position at the law office last year. I did, I answered calmly. I work part-time now at the literacy center. Judith nodded slowly in that fake sympathetic way rich people sometimes do when discussing someone they secretly consider a disappointment. Well, she replied, life certainly takes unexpected turns. Claire laughed softly beside her wine glass. Especially after divorce. Stephen smirked, but pretended to focus on cutting his turkey. I felt my chest tighten again, but before I could speak, Thomas reached for the bowl of mashed potatoes and quietly offered me some first. Such a small gesture. Yet somehow it grounded me more than anything else in that room. So Thomas, Stephen said loudly enough for the entire table to hear, how exactly does somebody make a living cleaning buildings these days? Judith shifted uncomfortably. Stephen, she warned softly. No, I am curious, he continued casually. I mean, inflation is rough for everybody. Thomas placed his fork down carefully. I do all right. Claire burst out laughing. That is the most humble answer I have ever heard. She looked directly at me. Helen, you always did have a thing for projects. Several people around the table chuckled nervously. One of Stephen's cousins looked down at his plate, clearly embarrassed, but nobody stopped them. Nobody ever stopped them. That was the Whitmore family way. As long as Cruelty wore expensive clothes and smiled politely, everyone pretended it was humor. Honestly, Stephen continued, leaning back in his chair, I just cannot picture you with somebody like him. You used to care about ambition. Thomas remained calm. A job does not define somebody's character. Stephen laughed. That sounds inspirational. Did you read that on a coffee mug while mopping floors? The laughter came louder this time. Claire nearly choked on her wine laughing. I felt humiliation burn across my face, but Thomas still did not react. He simply took a sip of water and looked at Stephen with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. And somehow that calmness only seemed to irritate Stephen more. Relax, Stephen said with a grin. We are all family here. Actually, I said quietly, he is not your family. The table fell silent for half a second. Stephen looked at me with surprise, almost offended that I had interrupted his performance. You know what I mean, he replied. I'm just trying to understand what happened. You used to want more out of life. I stared at him carefully then. 6 years ago, comments like that would have shattered me. Stephen always knew how to disguise insults as concern. It was one of the reasons I spent so many years doubting myself. But sitting beside Thomas now, I suddenly realized something painful. Stephen had never respected kindness because he only valued things that impressed other people. Titles, salaries, status, expensive watches, country club memberships. Everything in his world was performance. You know, Claire added smugly, I guess there is something romantic about dating a janitor. Very Hallmark movie. More laughter. Then Stephen raised his wine glass slightly and smirked directly at Thomas. Well, every family needs somebody willing to take out the trash. This time the silence afterward felt heavy enough to crack glass. Even Judith looked uncomfortable. But the worst part was not Stephen saying it. The worst part was realizing he genuinely thought he was superior. For a few long seconds nobody moved after Stephen made his little joke about taking out the trash. The only sound in the room came from the soft Christmas music playing somewhere in the background and the faint clink of silverware against china. I looked down at my plate because I suddenly understood something humiliating. They had planned this. Maybe not every word exactly, but the atmosphere, the performance, the invitation itself. Stephen had not invited me because he missed me. He invited me because he wanted an audience. Stephen, Judith finally said quietly, that was unnecessary. But even she did not sound angry, just mildly inconvenienced, like somebody apologizing for spilled wine on a carpet. Stephen raised one shoulder casually. It was a joke. Thomas folded his napkin carefully beside his plate. No offense taken, he said calmly. That only seemed to disappoint Stephen further. He wanted a reaction. Anger. Embarrassment. Anything that would make him feel powerful. Instead, Thomas simply sat there with the same steady expression he always carried, as though the opinions of shallow people could not possibly reach him. Claire leaned back in her chair dramatically. I swear, he is impossible to offend. Maybe because secure people do not need to prove anything. I said before I could stop myself. The table went quiet again. Stephen looked directly at me then, and for the first time all night, the smile slipped slightly from his face. You always get defensive when you know somebody hit a nerve, he replied. I almost answered him, but at that moment Judith accidentally knocked her wine glass with her elbow. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth and dripped onto the hardwood floor. Claire immediately groaned. Mom, be careful. Judith looked flustered and embarrassed. I am so sorry. Before anyone else moved, Thomas quietly stood up from his chair. Do not worry about it, he said gently. He walked into the kitchen, returned with towels, and calmly knelt beside the table to clean the spill before it stained the floorboards. You really do this professionally, Claire joked with a laugh. I wanted to disappear, but Thomas simply smiled politely. Years of experience. Stephen smirked into his glass again while watching Thomas wipe the floor. See, he muttered toward one of his cousins. The man found his calling. His cousin forced an awkward laugh, but avoided eye contact. Something about the scene suddenly made me deeply uncomfortable in a way I could not fully explain. Thomas was helping, being kind, solving a problem. Yet everyone at that table acted as though kindness itself lowered a person's value. Judith sighed with relief once the mess was cleaned. Thank you, Thomas. Of course. He returned to his seat without the slightest sign of irritation. A few minutes later, the lights above the dining room flickered suddenly. Then one side of the room went dark completely. Claire sighed dramatically. Perfect. This house is falling apart. Stephen rolled his eyes. The electrician was supposed to fix that last month. Thomas glanced upward calmly. Loose connection, probably. Stephen smirked again. Well, I guess tonight is your lucky night. You can work during dinner. I stared at him in disbelief. Stephen. What? He said innocently. The man literally works maintenance. Thomas stood slowly. I can take a quick look if you would like. Judith immediately nodded. Would you mind? Not at all. Thomas disappeared down the hallway toward the breaker panel while the rest of the family continued eating. Claire shook her head, laughing softly. Honestly, this is unbelievable. What is? I asked coldly. Your life, she replied. You used to host charity galas with Stephen. Now your fiancé fixes electrical problems during Christmas dinner. I looked toward the hallway where Thomas had disappeared. And somehow I am happier now than I ever was back then. Claire blinked at me, almost confused by the answer. 10 minutes later, the lights returned fully. Thomas walked back into the dining room, quietly wiping dust from his hands with a cloth Judith had given him. Should be good now, he said politely. Judith smiled with genuine relief. You are a lifesaver. Stephen gave a dry laugh. A janitor and an electrician. Very versatile. But before anyone could respond, Thomas's phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen briefly, and for the first time all evening, I noticed a subtle change in his expression. Not nervousness. Not embarrassment. Something else entirely. He looked at me calmly. Excuse me for just a moment, he said softly before stepping outside into the snowy night. The moment Thomas stepped outside, the energy in the dining room changed again. Stephen leaned back in his chair, looking almost amused with himself, like a man convinced he had completely controlled the evening. Claire reached for another glass of wine while Judith tried awkwardly to redirect the conversation toward holiday travel plans. But nobody really listened. Everyone was still thinking about Thomas. Or more specifically, about the role they had decided he belonged in. You know, Stephen said casually while cutting another piece of turkey, I almost admire him. I looked at him carefully. For what? Confidence, he replied. Most men would feel intimidated walking into a house like this knowing they are completely out of their league. I stared at him in disbelief. Even after all these years, Stephen still measured human value like a price tag. Bigger house, better suit, more expensive car. To him, status was personality. Thomas is not intimidated by you, I said quietly. Stephen laughed softly. That is because he probably does not understand the difference. Claire nearly spit out her wine, laughing. Oh my God, Stephen. Judith sighed tiredly. Please. It is Christmas. But there was no real authority in her voice anymore. She had allowed this behavior for too many years. Then suddenly headlights flashed through the large front windows facing the driveway. A long black Cadillac Escalade slowly pulled up outside the house, its tires crunching over fresh snow. The room grew quiet almost instantly. Are we expecting someone? Claire asked. Judith frowned. No. Stephen stood slightly to look through the window. Probably one of the neighbors. But before he could sit back down, the front door opened again. Cold winter air swept briefly into the foyer as Thomas stepped inside, followed by a tall man in a charcoal overcoat carrying a leather portfolio. The stranger looked to be in his early 50s, polished and professional, the kind of man who belonged in corporate boardrooms and private airports. The entire room fell silent when the man spoke. I apologize for interrupting Christmas dinner, Mr. Reed, he said respectfully. But the investors in Chicago are requesting your approval tonight before the market opens overseas. Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. Claire slowly lowered her wine glass. Stephen looked confused. Mr. Reed, the man, repeated politely. I have the acquisition documents ready for your signature. Thomas gave him a small nod. Thank you, David. I will only need a minute. My heart almost hurt watching the expressions around the table shift all at once. Stephen looked like somebody had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Judith stared at Thomas as though she was seeing him for the first time. Claire blinked repeatedly, trying to process what she was hearing. Wait, Stephen finally said slowly. Acquisition documents. Thomas remained perfectly calm. Business matters. Nothing important for tonight. David looked genuinely confused by the atmosphere in the room. His eyes moved briefly between everyone seated at the table before returning to Thomas. Sir, the board members are waiting on your confirmation regarding the Denver Property Group purchase. Stephen stood completely still. Property Group? David nodded politely without understanding the tension. Reed Commercial Services finalized the acquisition this afternoon. Silence swallowed the room. I could almost feel the humiliation shifting directions in real time. Claire glanced at Stephen nervously. Stephen, she whispered, is that not the company that owns? Yes, he snapped quietly. For the first time all evening, Stephen looked uncertain, truly uncertain. Thomas accepted the portfolio from David and signed several documents calmly on the foyer table while Snow drifted quietly outside behind them. No arrogance, no performance, no attempt to embarrass anyone. And somehow that made the moment even more devastating for the Whitmores. David smiled once the papers were complete. Congratulations again on the expansion, Mr. Reed. 300 employees across 4 states now. That is remarkable growth. Claire nearly choked on her drink. Judith looked at me speechless. Stephen stared directly at Thomas with an expression I had never seen before. Fear mixed with confusion. 300 employees? Judith finally whispered. Thomas handed the folder back to David politely. Good night. And please tell the team not to work too late on Christmas Eve. Of course, sir. David nodded respectfully and left as quietly as he had arrived. The front door closed. Silence settled over the house again. Then Thomas calmly returned to the dining table and sat beside me exactly as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The silence after David left felt completely different from the silence earlier that night. Before, it had been filled with smugness and hidden laughter. Now it was heavy with confusion. Nobody at that table knew how to behave anymore. Stephen stared at Thomas like he was trying to solve a puzzle that no longer made sense. Claire looked embarrassed for the first time all evening, quietly adjusting her necklace while avoiding eye contact with everyone. Judith cleared her throat softly and forced a nervous smile. Thomas, she said carefully, you never mentioned you owned a company. Thomas picked up his fork calmly. You never asked. Claire let out a small, awkward laugh. I thought you worked maintenance. I do, Thomas replied simply. Stephen frowned. You own Reed Commercial Services? Yes. The Reed Commercial Services? Thomas nodded once. Stephen looked stunned. Even I almost smiled watching the confidence drain slowly from his face. I knew about Thomas's company, of course, but Thomas never spoke about it unless absolutely necessary. Most people assumed he was just another maintenance worker because that was how he dressed and how he carried himself. He drove his own truck, visited properties personally, fixed broken equipment himself when crews were overwhelmed. He believed leadership meant showing up, not sitting behind glass office walls pretending to be important. You own buildings? Claire asked carefully. Some, Thomas answered. Maintenance contracts, commercial developments, property management. Mostly practical things. The understatement nearly made me laugh. Stephen suddenly sat straighter in his chair. Wait, he said slowly. Reed Commercial bought the Denver Property Group today? That is correct. Stephen stared at him in disbelief. My company leases 2 corporate offices from them. Thomas remained calm. Then I suppose our paths crossed long before tonight. Nobody laughed. The room had become painfully quiet now, every earlier insult hanging in. The air like smoke nobody could clear away. Judith folded her hands together nervously. I had no idea, she admitted softly. Thomas smiled politely. That is all right. But I noticed something important in that moment. Thomas was not enjoying this. He was not trying to embarrass them back. He was not arrogant or smug or cruel. In fact, he almost seemed uncomfortable with the attention. And somehow that made the Whitmores look even smaller. So you just clean buildings for fun? Claire finally asked. Thomas shook his head slightly. No. I work because I believe nobody should ask employees to do jobs they are unwilling to do themselves. Stephen let out a dry laugh, though it sounded weaker now. You expect me to believe the owner of a multi-state company spends his evenings fixing electrical panels? Sometimes, Thomas replied calmly. A loose wire does not care who owns the company. I could see Stephen struggling internally now. Men like him built their entire identity around hierarchy. Once that hierarchy collapsed, they had nothing left to stand on. Why would you let people assume you were just a janitor? Claire asked quietly. Thomas looked genuinely confused by the question. There is nothing wrong with being a janitor. Nobody answered him. Because the truth was uncomfortable. Everyone at that table had revealed exactly who they were long before they discovered who Thomas really was. Judith looked down at her plate for several seconds before finally speaking again. I owe you an apology. Thomas shook his head gently. That is not necessary. But Stephen suddenly interrupted. No, actually it is. His voice sounded strained now. Because apparently we all misunderstood the situation. I finally looked directly at him again. No, I said quietly. You understood the situation perfectly. You just thought somebody with a working-class job deserved less respect. Stephen opened his mouth, then stopped. For once in his life, he had no smooth response prepared. Claire stared into her wine glass silently. Judith looked embarrassed enough to cry. And sitting beside me, Thomas simply continued eating his dinner like none of this mattered nearly as much as they thought it did. That was when I realized the biggest difference between Thomas and the Whitmores. The Whitmores treated status like character. Thomas treated people like people. Outside, snow continued falling softly beyond the windows while Christmas lights reflected across the dark glass. Inside that expensive dining room, surrounded by polished silver and designer clothes and carefully rehearsed superiority, the only person who carried himself with genuine dignity was the man they had mocked all night. The rest of dinner moved awkwardly after that. Conversations started and died within seconds. Claire suddenly became fascinated with rearranging silverware on the table. Judith kept offering dessert to people who clearly were not hungry anymore. Stephen drank more wine than before, though it no longer gave him the relaxed confidence he carried earlier that evening. Every now and then his eyes drifted toward Thomas with a strange mixture of disbelief and calculation, like he was trying to rewrite the entire night in his head fast enough to save himself from embarrassment. But the damage had already been done. You cannot unring a bell after everyone hears it. Eventually Judith stood and announced coffee and dessert in the sitting room. People scattered quickly, grateful for an excuse to escape the tension hanging over the dining table. Thomas quietly helped carry dishes into the kitchen despite Judith insisting he did not need to. That was another thing about him. His kindness was never performance. He helped because helping was simply part of who he was. I stood near the fireplace, holding a cup of coffee, when Stephen approached me alone. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. Helen, he said quietly, can we talk for a minute? I hesitated before nodding. He led me toward the hallway near the study where the noise of the family faded slightly into the background. The Christmas lights from outside reflected dimly across the polished wood floors. Stephen loosened his tie slowly and sighed. You could have told me, he said. I stared at him. Told you what? About Thomas. Why would I need to? He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Come on. You knew how this looked. I almost laughed at that. How what looked? A maintenance guy showing up here with you. There it was again. Even now, after everything, Stephen still could not stop himself from reducing people to job titles. You mean a man who treats me with respect? I replied calmly. Stephen exhaled heavily. That is not fair. No, I said softly. What was unfair was inviting us here just to humiliate him. That was not my intention. I looked directly into his eyes then. Do not insult me by lying. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his shoulders dropped slightly, and for the first time all night, I saw exhaustion underneath his polished image. Things have not exactly been great lately, he admitted quietly. The market has been rough. Clients are pulling out. I have pressure coming from every direction. I folded my arms. And somehow that excuse is tonight. No, he paused. I just thought maybe we could reconnect. I blinked at him in disbelief. Reconnect? You were always stable, Helen. Loyal. You held everything together. The words hit me strangely because they sounded less like affection and more like desperation. Suddenly pieces of the evening started fitting together in my mind. The invitation. The fake nostalgia. The way Stephen kept mentioning our past. He never expected me to arrive happy. He expected me to arrive lonely. You thought I would still be waiting for you, I said quietly. Stephen looked away without answering immediately, which told me everything. My mother always said you were the only woman who truly cared about family, he admitted softly. She thought maybe after enough time, I actually felt sad for him then. Not because I wanted him back. Respect. His face tightened slightly because deep down he knew I was right. At that exact moment, Thomas appeared at the end of the hallway, carrying 2 coffee cups. Calm. Steady. Completely unaware that he looked more dignified than everyone else in that house combined. Stephen glanced toward him, then back at me. You really love him, do you not? He asked quietly. I smiled before I could stop myself. Yes, I answered. I really do. And somehow that seemed to hurt Stephen more than discovering Thomas was wealthy. When I returned to the sitting room, the atmosphere had shifted again, but not in a good way. It was quieter now, not because the tension had disappeared, but because everyone was carefully avoiding it. People were pretending to enjoy dessert, pretending to laugh at small comments, pretending the night had not completely fallen apart. Stephen stood near the fireplace, holding a glass of wine he was no longer drinking. Claire was seated on the couch, scrolling aimlessly on her phone, though I could tell she was not reading anything. Judith was speaking softly with a cousin about holiday travel, her voice tight with forced politeness. Thomas was standing near the window looking out at the snow, holding 2 cups of coffee like he had not just rewritten the entire structure of the evening. When I walked in, he turned slightly and handed me 1 cup without a word. That small gesture alone felt more grounding than anything that had happened in the entire house. Stephen noticed immediately. He watched the exchange carefully, his expression unreadable for a moment before he looked away. But I could tell something had changed in him, slowly emptied into silence. Stephen was the last one left of his side of the family. He stood near the hallway staring at me and Thomas like he was trying to find the version of the evening where he still had control. Helen, he said finally. I looked at him calmly. Yes. He hesitated. That hesitation alone was new. Stephen Whitmore had always been the kind of man who never paused. He always spoke like every sentence was already decided. But now he looked like someone standing on unfamiliar ground. I did not mean for things to go like this, he said quietly. Actually smiled. That sounds worse. It was, he agreed calmly. We stood there together in the warm light of the room that had spent the entire evening feeling cold despite all the decorations. Outside, snow continued falling gently over the driveway, covering tire tracks and footprints like the night was trying to erase itself. I realized then that nothing about my life felt small anymore. Not the way Stephen had once made it feel. Not the way this family had tried to reduce it. Because the man standing beside me was not just someone they had underestimated. He was someone who never needed to announce his worth in the first place. And for the first time in a very long time, I understood that I did not need to prove anything to anyone ever again. The house felt different after the last door closed. Not just quieter, but emptied of something heavier than people. Even the Christmas decorations seemed less impressive now, as if the sparkle had been drained out of them by the night itself. I stood near the fireplace holding the same cup of coffee, listening to the soft crackle of burning wood, while Thomas slowly walked over and placed his empty cup on the side table. Neither of us spoke for a moment. There was nothing urgent left to say, only the aftermath of everything that had already been understood without words. Outside, snow continued to fall steadily across the driveway, covering every trace of the earlier arrivals, smoothing out tire marks, softening footprints, making it almost look like nothing unusual had ever happened here at all. Are you okay? Thomas asked finally. I nodded slowly. I think I am more than okay, I said quietly. And I realized I meant it. Not the kind of okay that comes from surviving something difficult, but the kind that comes from no longer needing approval from people who never saw you clearly in the first place. Thomas leaned back slightly against the edge of the fireplace mantel. They were not kind tonight, he said calmly. I let out a soft breath that was almost a laugh. That is one way to describe it. He nodded once. People often reveal more about themselves when they think they are in control. I looked at him. You were. Not surprised by any of it. Were you? Thomas thought for a moment before answering honestly. No. I have been in rooms like this before. Different names, same behavior. That answer stayed with me longer than anything else. Because it meant tonight had not been about Thomas at all. It had been about people like Stephen and Claire and Judith exposing who they were when they believed there were no consequences. I walked a few steps closer to the window and looked out at the snow-covered yard. The world outside looked calm, almost untouched, like it had no memory of the tension inside the house. Stephen thought I would still be waiting for him, I said quietly. Thomas did not respond immediately. He did not rush to reassure me or criticize Stephen. He simply listened. That was another thing I had come to understand about him. He never filled silence just to avoid it. He does not know who you are now, Thomas said finally. I turned back toward him. And who am I now? I asked. He looked at me with the same steady calm he had shown all evening. Someone who does not need to shrink herself to fit inside someone else's expectations. The words landed gently but firmly, like something that had always been true even before I was ready to hear it. I felt something inside me settle. Not excitement. Not revenge. Something quieter. Stability. For a long time, I had measured my life by how others responded to it. Whether I was impressive enough. Whether I was chosen enough. Whether I was enough at all. Tonight had stripped all of that away in the most unexpected way. Not through conflict, but through clarity. I walked back toward the couch and sat down slowly. Thomas joined me a moment later, resting his hands loosely together. The house creaked softly around us as it cooled from the warmth of the evening. Do you regret coming tonight? I asked him. He considered the question carefully. No, he said. It showed you something you needed to see. I nodded slowly. It showed me something I should have seen a long time ago. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that no longer felt heavy. Eventually, I glanced toward the hallway where Stephen had stood. Earlier, where voices had risen and fallen, where everything had briefly felt like a performance designed to measure worth instead of understand it. That version of the night already felt distant now, like something that belonged to someone else's life. Thomas stood up first, picking up his coat from the chair. It is getting late, he said gently. I looked at the clock and realized he was right. Time had moved strangely all evening, stretching and compressing in ways I had not noticed. I walked him to the door. The cold air from outside rushed in the moment it opened, sharp and clean compared to the warmth inside. Before stepping out, Thomas paused and looked back at me. Helen, he said quietly. I met his eyes. Yes. You did well tonight, he said simply. There was no exaggeration in his voice. No attempt to make it sound dramatic. Just a calm acknowledgement of something real. I felt my throat tighten slightly, but I managed to smile. So did you. He gave a small nod, then stepped out into the snow. I watched him walk down the driveway toward his truck, the falling snow softening the edges of his figure until he blended into the quiet night. When he drove away, I did not feel emptiness. I felt something steadier. Like the end of a long noise I had stopped noticing I was living inside. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence of my own home. For the first time in years, it did not feel like something I had to fill. It felt like something I could finally live in.